certainty than a lot of other emerging technologies that when we make it, it's going to be useful.
Right. Feels like sort of all the mega caps are now doing quantum in some way or the other, but is it fair to say that like Google was one of the earliest big tech companies in this space?
Yeah, I think when Google got involved back in the day, a lot of people started taking the industry a lot more seriously. They're like, oh my gosh, Google's involved. Like, this looks like a real thing. We should pay attention. And I think we've been able to demonstrate the track record that that's been a good investment in terms of the scientific results coming out of our Beyond Classical demonstration 2019, showing that we can build a quantum computer that can outcompute the world's largest supercomputer at something, and then our most recent breakthroughs with Willow.
How do you make sure that you ship when you need to, right? You move from the research and development phase to make sure that you're taking advantage of commercialization whenever that happens, or breakthroughs when it needs to.
That's a great question. And our focus really has been keeping our eye on when do we actually get to applications that can be solved on a quantum computer better than a supercomputer. And so what you see in our scientific results is we're typically making that comparison. And we think that the most important thing is to do that first and then have the product side can be involved once we have like the core demonstration of the technology.
Speaking of those core demonstrations, why was Willow such a breakthrough for the industry?
Yeah, so Willow did two really important things. So one, we used Willow to revisit this standard benchmark where we compare it to the world's largest supercomputer, because that's basically what our competition really is at the end of the day. We want to beat classical computers. And we didn't run this benchmark problem that we can run on Willow in just a couple of minutes that would take 10 septillion years, 10 to the 25 years, way longer the age of the universe. And what that means is that problem would be just impossible for a classical computer to solve. So that's one. And then number two is basically opening the door to the future. We show that we can be what is called below threshold for quantum error correction. What that means is Willow has shown that we can scale our system up, make very large computers in the future that will be able to solve generic and useful applications.
How is that different than some of the releases we've seen from other mega caps over the last few months, especially for someone who, doesn't really understand the error rate or even 10 septillion years? Like, how can you put it in perspective?
Yeah, I think what's really important for people to understand who don't have as much familiarity in space is at the end of the day, we're making a computer. Sometimes people hear quantum computer and they kind of throw out everything they know, but it's a computer, and computers have specifications. They have things like how fast you can run it, how large it is, what types of benchmark problems you can solve. And this is how we grade ourselves, and this is a good metric to figure out how to understand the progression of technology in the field. So for example, with our Willow announcement, we released a spec sheet that goes with it that tells you all the different pieces that we think are important and what the numerical values are. And you can use that to compare with other technologies to see where they're at. And we also run these benchmark problems, like I told you, this 10 septillion years one. That's another example where you kind of put the whole system together, see how well it runs. You can compare it with other quantum computers, and you can compare it with the world's largest supercomputer.
Is that standardized? If you have a breakthrough, is it expected that you also release a spec sheet? For example, did Microsoft have a spec sheet that accompanied its announcement? Did Amazon?
I would say that not all programs are releasing spec sheets that go with their announcements. Sometimes you can find it in, say, the scientific papers, or sometimes you can find pieces of it. But a thing that really we want to drive towards is kind of capturing all of those metrics, not just some, but all of them at the same time, to go with our announcements so people understand where the state of the art and the technology is at.
Okay. Let's talk about how quantum computing relates to artificial intelligence. I guess when we spoke previously, there was this idea that in the future, quantum computing can supercharge AI. Is that right?
Yeah, we think that quantum computing and AI can really complement each other.
Walk me through how quantum computing can complement AI.
So there's a number of things that quantum computers can do, but in this particular case, for example, AI in AlphaFold, it trains on data that's provided that's informed by quantum mechanics, but that's actually not that common. So a thing that, for example, a quantum computer could do is generate data that then AI could be trained on in order to give it a little bit more information about how quantum mechanics works.
Got it. You talked about having your eye on the applications. What are the applications? How far away are we from that?
Yeah, good question. So we think we're about 5 years out from a real breakout kind of practical application that you could only solve on a quantum computer. But there's a whole host of kind of interesting example application areas. Again, I mentioned that quantum computers are so interesting because there's some kind of theoretical guarantees that they can simulate quantum mechanics that's relevant in many different areas. But of course, you can pick your favorite. Like there's a fun story around fertilizer. I don't know if you happen to know this one. So it turns out that a very large amount of the world's energy usage goes towards making fertilizer using something called the Haber-Bosch process. And it uses like high temperature and high pressure. And this is actually like a revolution in industrial chemistry like 100 years ago. Because before that, the way that we used to get fertilizer, we'd actually send ships out into the Pacific Ocean, chip bird poop off of these islands out there in the middle of nowhere, and then bring them back. So this process is way better than that. Yeah. But at the same time, if you just look in like the soil and plants, there's bacteria that will do this at like standard temperatures and pressures way more efficiently. And we'd love to just copy them, right? They're doing a great job, but we don't know how. But if we had a quantum computer, we could see how they work, use that to solve, for example, this fertilizer production issue, and then save humanity a whole bunch of energy.
Interesting. Is that one of the solutions or applications we could see in 5 years?
I think that one's a little bit further out, but it's one of those things that, again, is like a very concrete example of how a quantum computer could be applied.
Right. What's something we could see in 5 years?
I think.
And how will we know if you've reached that benchmark? Too?
Yeah.
Like, how do you measure?
So that's a good question. The first applications we think are going to be in places that are like really kind of like just kind of cutting edge physics areas where you've got some system that's sort of just out of reach of what a classical computer to do, but a quantum computer can kind of just put you past it to give you important scientific insights. Something that's really important and that we take very seriously at Google is making sure that we kind of red team the problems that we're working on. Like, we want to make sure that if we're making a claim that something is better on a quantum computer, we really rigorously test it against the classical side and have people look at the best classical algorithms so that people can be confident that when we say that we have a breakthrough, we actually have it. And that's something very important for us.
When Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, like the godfather of computing, said we're at least 15 years away, and it felt like he was pouring some cold water on the space, how does that differ from what you're saying? What's he looking at?
I would say that there's a lot of nuance in quantum computing, and it depends on kind of what you're saying, like when the revolution has happened. I think there will be early signs that, again, we're running things that can't be solved anywhere, and then there'll be sort of a late retrospective of like, oh, clearly quantum computing is super important. And we're confident that we're going to get there because we know that these things can do things that nothing else can do. So I think it's just a matter of where maybe an individual would call the revolution has happened.
When do you think enterprises start to adopt it? It felt like, ChatGPT was the moment that made clear to consumers and enterprises how they can use AI in their own businesses or personal use. When does that happen for quantum computing? When does it go past the scientific research phase into consumer and enterprise?
Yeah, I think, again, the most important thing to look for in the next couple of years is this practical application where you can do something that has physical relevance. You can kind of imagine how that transforms.
Everyone has two chapters in their lives. Before their first Big Mac and after their first Big Mac. Spoiler, the best chapter is the last. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
A real-world problem, and it can only be done on a quantum computer. I think at that point, it behooves everyone to pay attention to the field.
Right. You said that AI is one of these applications that may be further away. What would we have to see to know that we're getting closer to that moment?
The way that we see it is at Google, we have something called a hardware roadmap. So there's sort of a hardware track, and then there's an applications track. And where we want to get to on the hardware track is to build sort of a scale model of this error-corrected quantum computer. So this is the thing that Willow opened the door to. It says this, in fact, is possible with exactly what you're building right now. You got to scale it up, make it bigger, make it better. We think by the time we have that machine end to end, we'll have completed this kind of 0 to 1 moment for making an error-corrected quantum computer. It'll be very you can understand it, benchmark it, look at it. And from the hardware side, that's really the thing that we're marching towards as fast as possible. Then you take that machine and you match it with an application that can then fit inside that computational capacity. And that's when you kind of have like the killer mix in quantum.
Great. What is maybe the most unappreciated thing about the space right now? Is it the timeline? To me, 5 years is not something that I hear on a regular basis, but you are very confident in that projection.
I think, you know, what's really interesting in the field is that, like, when I started a number of years ago, people actually thought that building a quantum computer was impossible. They thought like, oh, there's no way the physics isn't going to work out, quantum error correction is going to fall over. But there's just growing more and more confidence that a quantum computer is possible to build and will be built. And we spend more of our time thinking about what types of things will we do with it, how is it going to work to benefit society, rather than kind of agonizing over if the fundamental physics is going to play out.
Do you think about competitors? Who would they be? Or...
You know, it's a good question. I would say that truly we think our competition here is classical computing and nature. We want to harness nature and show that we can use quantum mechanics to actually solve problems that can't be solved in any other way. And you know, our competition is classical computing, which is, it's a high bar. You know, humanity has put a huge amount of time and effort into making computers work extremely well. So we need to get over that hump, but we're confident that we will.
Google was underappreciated in artificial intelligence for a long time. Do you think it's being underappreciated right now in quantum computing?
I will say that I think not the average layperson doesn't understand how important quantum computing will be and the types of problems that it can solve. And it can be tricky, again, because there's a lot of noise in the space. It's hard to understand from one headline or another what's really happening. And so again, a thing that I want to get across here is like it's a physics but also an engineering discipline. You can go look at the numbers, you can really make that tangible.
When you say physics and engineering, I understand like these are enormous feats, but it's hard for the average person to grasp onto, right? And like we saw that with ChatGPT. There was so much interesting happening in AI, but until like you could put an interface in front of someone and they could play around with it themselves, and the average person is not a physicist or an engineer. Like, what is that point? When do we get to that point with quantum? Do we ever? Is it going to be packaged into something else?
So I think by the time we build like a scaled error correction computer, then error correction applies this interface to it that makes it much easier to access than the computers that we have right now. It makes it look much more like a normal computer and how you program it. Whereas right now, if you go interface with the computers in the lab, it can feel a little bit more like a physics experiment. They're kind of fine-tuning knobs and things of that nature. So I think when we have that sort of interface layer placed on top of it, it will open the doors to many other people being able to interact with the technology, and I think that's going to be a very transformational moment.
Right now, we're at a moment, the last few months with AI, where we talk a lot about this data wall and how, you know, the x-axis has kind of, we're stopped and we're just going up the y-axis now, right? Because there's only so much data in the world. What does quantum computing do to that chart and to models and frontier models?
Yeah, again, I think, you know, one of the potential applications that you can think of for a quantum computer is generating new and novel data. And there may be new methods that only kind of quantum information processing might be able to use to break down some of the fundamental barriers that may exist, but that's a little bit speculative, to be honest.
Why is the promise of quantum computing doing that different than AI creating its own synthetic data, which has sort of been not a very effective way to reach new frontiers?
Yeah, and again, it comes back to this, you know, the AI models that people use are built on classical computers, and they fundamentally can't speak the language of quantum mechanics where a quantum computer can. And it really goes down to that kind of foundational level of like, quantum computers speak quantum mechanics, they can access the way the universe works at the most fundamental level, and there's a lot of potential in, you know, solving entirely new problems by being able to build a machine that works like that.